Have you ever wondered why humanity has always felt watched, even when no one is around? Why ancient civilizations across the world, from Mesopotamia to pre-Hellenistic Egypt, described invisible rulers who manipulated fate from behind the veil? And why, for thousands of years, the movement of the stars was treated not only as a map of the sky, but as a coded message about forces that do not want to be seen? What if the constellations you look at every night were not simply cosmic decorations, but warnings left by those who understood the truth long before us? Tonight, you and I are going to enter a territory most people never dare to explore, a place where astronomy, mythology, and forbidden Gnostic writings converge into a single revelation: the origin of the Archons, the entities that ancient mystics believed controlled human destiny. But the most unsettling question is not where they came from. It's where they are now. And as you'll see, the answer is far closer than anyone imagines. Before revealing anything, let me ask you something directly. Have you ever felt as if your thoughts were not entirely your own? As if a sudden sadness, a sudden fear, or a sudden impulse appeared out of nowhere? Many people dismiss these sensations as psychological noise, but ancient Gnostic communities believed they were signals, tiny cracks in the illusion showing that something inhuman was influencing human consciousness. And according to them, the signs of these forces were written in the stars themselves, encoded in a cosmic pattern only the awakened could read. In this video, we will explore how this stellar code was created, how it was later distorted by systems of power, and how its meaning survived in hidden texts, waiting for someone like you to rediscover it. The answers may challenge your beliefs, shake your understanding of the universe, and force you to question everything you thought you knew about spiritual freedom. But that's exactly why this journey matters. If you're someone who seeks truth, not comfort, not tradition, but truth, then subscribe to this channel and join thousands of people who refuse to live inside the illusion. This is a safe space for seekers, for questioners, for those who sense that reality is larger, deeper, and stranger than we were taught. And as we move further into this revelation, I want you to stay with me until the very end, because the final insight will change the way you understand your own mind. Tell me in the comments, have you ever felt watched by something you couldn't see? For centuries, humanity believed that the stars existed only to guide travelers and mark the seasons. But ancient mystics, especially the early Gnostic groups, claimed something far more unsettling. The stars were once understood as a cosmic code, a map revealing the origin of the Archons and their influence over human consciousness. According to these mystics, this code was not poetic or symbolic. It was literal, a blueprint of spiritual forces that interacted with humanity long before organized religion emerged. The problem is that most of this knowledge was buried, erased, or intentionally rewritten. The question is, why? Who would benefit from hiding a map that exposes the entities shaping human behavior from behind the veil? Early Gnostic texts like the Apocryphon of John describe the Archons as rulers of the spheres, beings tied to the 7 classical planets: Saturn, Jupiter, Mars, the Sun, Venus, Mercury, and the Moon. These planets, arranged in the ancient heavens, were not just celestial bodies. The Gnostics saw them as layers of control, barriers between the human soul and the true divine source. And the constellations around them, especially those near the ecliptic, formed what they believed to be a coded warning system. In their view, the sky itself was a locked door, and the Archons were its gatekeepers. But something happened that changed everything. As empires rose, especially during the early Roman and later medieval Christian eras, this stellar interpretation began to fade. Astronomical knowledge was absorbed into state-sanctioned religion. Astrology was sanitized, mythologized, and slowly stripped of its Gnostic meanings. Some scholars believe this was not an accident. If the Archons were seen as metaphors for systemic control, political, spiritual, psychological, then erasing the code meant preserving the system. After all, a population that knows who influences them is far harder to dominate. This raises the question I want to ask you now. Do you think systems of power would allow humanity to keep a map that reveals its own hidden controllers? Tell me in the comments what you think. As the original code disappeared, only fragments survived, encoded myths, half-translated manuscripts, mysterious astronomical diagrams discovered in caves and forgotten libraries. And this is where the real mystery begins, because when you compare these fragments, something extraordinary appears. The same symbols, the same star patterns, the same warnings, repeated across ancient cultures that never met. In this block, we've uncovered the central problem. A cosmic code once used to identify the Archons was systematically distorted or erased. But in the next block, we'll dive deeper into the origin of these beings and how ancient sages believed they emerged from a cosmic error one that still echoes in the structure of the heavens today. To understand how the Archons came into existence, we must step far beyond the borders of traditional religion and into the most mysterious layer of Gnostic cosmology. According to the early Gnostic sages, the universe did not begin with chaos and matter. It began with mind, with consciousness itself. The highest reality, what they called the true source, or the invisible spirit, emanated countless expressions of pure intelligence. These emanations were known as eons, and together they formed the pleroma, the realm of absolute unity and light. But among these emanations, one event changed the destiny of every soul that would ever exist. Gnostic texts describe a particular eon named Sophia, associated with wisdom, intuition, and cosmic creation. Sophia longed to create something of her own without the collaboration of the other eons. Some scholars interpret this as a metaphor for spiritual curiosity, a divine impulse to explore the unknown. Others see it as a poetic explanation for why imperfection exists in a universe that was supposed to be perfect. In either case, the Gnostics believed her solitary action produced an unexpected result, a flawed being one that did not reflect the perfection of its source. This being was the Demiurge, the first Archon. Described as powerful but blind, creative but ignorant, the Demiurge did not understand where he came from. Believing himself to be the true God, he began to shape material reality. And as he created the physical cosmos, he also produced lesser beings in his own image, the Archons, each associated with a sphere of the heavens. These entities were not evil in the human sense, but they operated with a single purpose: to maintain the structure of the world created by their flawed father, and to keep humanity unaware of the higher realms above them. Now here is where the stars enter the story in a way most people have never heard. In the Gnostic worldview, the spheres of the planets acted like layers of the Demiurge's illusion. Each planet represented a level of influence, a filter that trapped the human soul as it descended into the physical world. When the soul eventually ascended after death, it would have to pass through these same layers, and each Archon would challenge it, testing whether it had awakened to its true origin. Ancient astrologers, many of whom were influenced by Gnostic ideas, mapped these planetary layers onto the sky. The constellations along the ecliptic zodiac were seen as the outer markings of the archonic system, not because the stars controlled human fate, but because they reflected the architecture of the spiritual cosmos. In other words, the sky was a diagram of the invisible prison surrounding the human soul. But the most intriguing part is this: the Gnostics believed the stars also preserved the memory of Sophia's mistake. They claimed that certain constellations, especially those associated with serpents, wings, or fallen beings, were symbolic reminders of the moment the Demiurge came into existence. The celestial dragon, the winged mare, the chaotic sea monster. These were not random myths, but cosmic echoes of the primordial error. Over time, this interpretation became dangerous. Systems of power, whether religious or political, did not want people thinking they were trapped in a spiritual illusion created by flawed rulers of the cosmos. As institutional religion gained influence, the story of Sophia and the origin of the Archons was labeled heresy. The heavens were reinterpreted, the myths sanitized, the symbols softened. What remained was only the surface, pretty constellations and harmless fables. But underneath, the original message still vibrates, waiting for those who have eyes to see. Tell me in the comments, do you believe the universe could contain a mistake so powerful that it shaped everything we know? If the stars once served as a cosmic map, revealing the origin and nature of the Archons, then the greatest mystery is not how the code was created, but how it was erased. Understanding this erasure is essential, because it explains why modern people look at the sky and see only astronomy, while the ancients saw a living diagram of spiritual forces. What happened between those two worlds is one of the most subtle and powerful transformations in human history. After the rise of the Demiurge and his Archons, as described in Gnostic mythology, material universe was formed as a kind of spiritual enclosure. The Gnostics believed that the heavens were structured in layers: the firmament, the planetary spheres, and the zodiacal circle. But instead of being symbols of divine order, these layers represented barriers. The constellations, especially those marking the path of the sun, were like seals locking the human soul inside the illusion. This might sound poetic, but for ancient initiates, it was very literal. They believed that every movement of the planets, every cycle of the stars, and every shift in the zodiac corresponded to the actions of archonic forces. The sky wasn't just a clock, it was a system of control. But here is where the historical transformation begins. As the Hellenistic world expanded, astrology grew into a sophisticated science, merging astronomy with spiritual interpretation. Temples aligned with the stars, philosophical schools linked celestial patterns to human behavior, and mystery traditions passed down coded knowledge through symbols and rituals. However, the Gnostic interpretation was radically different from the mainstream view. Where others saw order and harmony, Gnostics saw imprisonment and manipulation. This difference was dangerous. When Christianity began to spread, it encountered a world full of mystical traditions that spoke openly of cosmic rulers, planetary deities, and star-born spirits. Many early Christians themselves used astrological motifs, Jesus associated with Pisces, the Magi following a star, the 12 apostles mirroring the zodiac. But as the religion became institutionalized, a shift occurred. The church began to condemn what it considered pagan cosmology, not because the ideas were untrue, but because they offered an alternative framework of power. Imagine the implications. If the planets were archons, not divine instruments, then the church could not claim to be the sole gateway to salvation. If the stars encoded a warning about cosmic forces, then spiritual authority would not depend on earthly institutions. And if Sophia's story contained the key to liberating the soul, then the hierarchy of priests and emperors would lose their influence. So the erasure began not violently at first, but subtly. Certain interpretations were labeled superstition. Others were absorbed and rebranded. Astrology was allowed only in its most harmless form, as personality traits and seasonal guidance, stripped of cosmic rebellion. Texts containing dangerous teachings, like the hypostasis of the Archons or the Apocryphon of John, were buried, burned, or declared forbiddance. Over centuries, the night sky was transformed into something purely scientific. Astronomy flourished, astrology became entertainment, and the deeper spiritual code faded from collective memory. But some traces remained. Monasteries preserved mysterious diagrams that didn't fit with official doctrine. Desert scrolls described planetary gatekeepers. Medieval alchemists hinted at celestial prisons and invisible rulers. Every so often, a scholar rediscovered a suppressed manuscript and realized that the heavens once carried a message far more complex than mythology. This raises a question I want to ask you now. Why would systems of power fear a spiritual map hidden in the stars? What do you think would change if people knew the full story? Tell me in the comments. Your perspective matters. In the next block, we'll dive into the turning point of the revelation, the rediscovered fragments that reveal the Archon's true nature and hint at where they might be operating today. For centuries, the celestial map was buried, fragmented, or rewritten. But history has a strange habit. The truth refuses to stay silent forever. In the last century, a series of unexpected discoveries completely shifted our understanding of the ancient world, discoveries that many scholars quietly admit were far more disruptive than the public realizes. These findings form the turning point of our investigation because they reveal how the Archons were understood not as mythological beings, but as active forces shaping human perception. It all began in 1945, near a small Egyptian town called Nag Hammadi. Hidden inside sealed jars, buried in the desert for more than 1,500 years, were over 50 ancient manuscripts. These texts were untouched, unedited, and unfiltered by institutional religion. Among them were the hypostasis of the Archons, the origin of the world, and the Apocryphon of John documents that described the structure of the invisible rulers with shocking precision. What startled scholars the most wasn't their mythological content, but their cosmic diagrams, star alignments, and instructions for recognizing the forces that shape the worlds. Some of the diagrams, once decoded, appeared to map not only the 7 planetary spheres, but specific constellations connected to the archonic hierarchy. For example, one fragment describes a serpent of the north sky whose coils encircle the souls of men. Another speaks of the watchers positioned in the stations of the wanderers, referencing the classical planets. But the most mysterious line repeated in multiple texts states, "Their thrones move, but their influence does not." Some scholars interpret this to mean the Archons were not confined to the ancient understanding of the heavens. Their seats may have shifted, but their presence persists. Around the same time, archaeologists at Qumran discovered the Dead Sea Scrolls. While not explicitly Gnostic, some scrolls mention the dominions of the air, the powers of the firmament, and beings who interfere with the mind of mankind. When you compare these descriptions with the Nag Hammadi texts, a pattern emerges. Multiple groups, separated by centuries, warned of invisible entities whose influence filters through realms both physical and non-physical. So what does this mean for us today? Modern researchers, especially those who examine ancient cosmology through a psychological lens, suggest that the Archons may represent forces that operate through thought, emotion, and perception. These forces do not need to be physical to be real. They shape human behavior through fear, confusion, division, and distraction, much like the Gnostics described. Some even argue that the Archons are better understood as parasitic patterns of consciousness, influencing society through systems, institutions, and human weakness. This introduces a new possibility. The Archons may no longer be viewed solely as cosmic beings tied to planetary movements. Instead, they may be expressions of collective psychological forces, structures of control that adapt to each era. And if that is true, then their thrones shifting could refer to their influence transforming across time, from ancient celestial symbolism to modern ideological and social systems. Think about that for a moment. Do you believe humanity can be influenced not only by physical events, but by patterns of fear, desire, and illusion that repeat across generations? If so, maybe the Gnostics were trying to warn us in the only language they had, the stars. This block marks a turning point because it shows us something crucial. The Archons were never just figures in the sky. They were never limited to one interpretation, and they were never gone. They simply changed form. In the next block, we will explore how this affects your life today, and how the ancient stellar code can be read in the modern world. If the Archons were once understood as cosmic forces tied to planetary spheres, and later as psychological or systemic influences, then the most important question becomes, how do they operate today? The answer is more subtle and more unsettling than anything the ancient Gnostics could have imagined. Because the modern world has created new structures, new technologies, and new forms of influence that mirror the very patterns the Archons were said to use. In a sense, the old code written in the stars has migrated into the fabric of contemporary life. The Gnostics believed the Archons manipulated humanity through confusion, fear, imitation, and distraction. These forces, they said, worked through thoughts and emotions, pushing people away from their divine origin and into a state of spiritual sleep. When you compare that ancient description to the way modern systems shape our perception media cycles, constant noise, algorithmic manipulation, institutional pressure, it's hard not to see the parallel. Some scholars even argue that the Archons, understood as forces of the psyche, have become stronger in a world where attention itself is a commodity. Think about the structure of the old celestial spheres for a moment. Each layer acted as a filter the soul had to pass through before reaching clarity. Today, we experience something similar in the form of mental layers, social expectations, cultural narratives, political divides, and the endless stream of digital stimuli. All of them shape how we think, how we feel, and how we interpret reality. In a very real way, these are the modern spheres the human soul must navigate. The ancient code written in the stars was a warning. These forces are subtle, persistent, and adaptive. They don't operate like demons or monsters. They operate like patterns. And patterns are difficult to detect unless you know what you're looking for. The Gnostics taught that the first sign of archonic influence was the sudden appearance of intrusive thoughts, fear, self-doubt, hopelessness that did not come from the soul's true essence. Today, we might call these things stress, anxiety, or internalized expectations. But the ancient sages believed these states were not natural to the human spirit. They were symptoms of an environment designed to keep the soul asleep. Another key teaching was imitation. The Archons were described as beings who imitate without understanding, meaning they could mimic light, but not create it. Some scholars interpret this as a metaphor for shallow truths ideas that appear enlightening but lack depth. In a modern context, this might look like half-knowledge, oversimplified spirituality, or the illusion of understanding created by endless information. We live in a world overflowing with data, but starving for wisdom. The Gnostics would say, this is exactly how archonic influence appears. So where does this leave us? If the Archons once ruled the spheres of the heavens, perhaps today they rule the spheres of influence, the systems, beliefs, and psychological patterns that shape human behavior. And this means the ancient stellar code is not just a relic of the past. It is a guide for recognizing where our inner freedom is challenged in the present. Let me ask you directly, have you ever felt that something invisible pushes you into fear, conformity, or emotional exhaustion? Many people experience this without having a name for it. The Gnostics offered one explanation. These are the fingerprints of archonic influence, updated for the modern era. In the next block, we will reach the heart of the revelation, the reflective climax, the forbidden insight the Gnostics tried to preserve, the one that threatens the very structure of illusion. We have arrived at the point where all the fragments, all the symbols, and all the warnings converge into a single revelation, one that the ancient world guarded with secrecy, and which systems of power quietly resisted for centuries. This is the moment where the investigation turns inward, because the code written in the stars was never only about the Archons. It was also about you, about the nature of human consciousness, and the secret that terrifies every structure built on control. According to the Gnostics, the greatest mistake humanity makes is believing the Archons operate out there, in the heavens, in the planets, in invisible realms. But the forbidden insight, the one almost never taught openly, is that the Archons operate within, not as literal entities living under the zodiac, but as patterns embedded into the psyche, inherited through culture, passed along through fear, and activated whenever a human being forgets their origin. This is the climax of the ancient revelation. The Archons control the world only to the extent that they control the mind. And this is exactly why the stars were used as a map. The heavens showed the architecture of illusion, but the real prison is internal, the beliefs, emotions, and narratives that keep a person disconnected from their inner source. In Gnostic symbolism, the journey of the soul through the planetary spheres was never about traveling through space. It was about escaping layers of false identity. Imagine the sky not as a physical object, but as a mirror. The constellations represent the structures of the psyche. The planetary spheres correspond to emotional layers. The zodiacal wheel reflects the continuous cycle of unconscious patterns. What the Archons guard is not the cosmos. It's the doorway between the conditioned mind and the awakened one. This is why ancient initiates learned passwords, hymns, and mantras before ascending past the Archons. These weren't magical phrases. They were psychological tools. Recognizing an Archon meant recognizing a fear, a fixation, or a lie that had gained control over one's thoughts. Speaking the hymn was the symbolic act of breaking that influence. Now think of how the modern world functions. Every day, people repeat their own internal scripts. I'm not enough. I don't deserve better. This is just how life is. I can't change. These are the new archonic hymns, phrases that maintain the illusion. The forbidden insight hidden in the stars is that the greatest power of the Archons is convincing humanity that the prison is external. If people believe the barriers are outside themselves, they never challenge the ones inside. And that is the tragedy the Gnostics tried to prevent. Let me ask you something now, directly and honestly. What fear, belief, or emotional pattern feels like it has controlled you more than you have controlled it? This question is not rhetorical. It is part of the ancient process. Naming the pattern is how you weaken it. Another part of the forbidden insight is even more provocative. The Archons cannot create. They can only imitate. They reproduce illusions, repeat distortions, and amplify whatever fear already exists. That means the only real source of light, the only creator in your inner world, is you. The stars were a reminder of this. Amidst the darkness of the sky, light always comes from within. This is why the stellar map was erased. Not because it revealed monsters in the heavens, but because it revealed power in the human soul. A population that understands its own inner light cannot be controlled by systems of fear. In the final block, we will bring everything together: the origin, the distortion, the modern influence, and the personal awakening that frees one from invisible rulers. We have traveled through the forgotten heavens, followed the trail of erased knowledge, uncovered fragments hidden for centuries, and confronted the possibility that the Archons, far from being distant cosmic rulers, exist as patterns, influences, and psychological forces woven into the fabric of modern life. But now we arrive at the final revelation, the one that transforms knowledge into awakening. The stellar code was never meant to terrify you. It was meant to liberate you. Ancient mystics used the sky as their symbol, not because the stars controlled destiny, but because the stars reflected a simple truth. Even in the deepest darkness, light shines. The constellations were messages, not prisons. Reminders, not chains. They were a way to say, across millennia, that every soul contains its own spark of the true source, a spark the Archons cannot imitate, cannot possess, and cannot extinguish. The error of Sophia, the birth of the demiurge, the creation of the Archons, these were never meant to be stories of despair. They were explanations for why humans feel divided inside themselves, why we wrestle with impulses that do not feel like our own, why we carry fears that seem older than memory. Understanding this was the first step toward reclaiming inner sovereignty. The Gnostics believed that once a person recognized the false layers of influence, the illusion began to dissolve. Awareness is the first form of freedom. So what does this awakening look like in the modern world? It begins when you notice that not every thought that enters your mind deserves your attention. It deepens when you refuse to obey impulses rooted in fear, shame, or confusion. It strengthens when you recognize patterns, internal or external, that try to reduce your sense of worth. Every moment of clarity, every decision made from inner truth rather than inherited belief, is an act of rebellion against the Archons. And this is where you become part of the ancient story. Because the stellar code was never meant for a chosen few. It was meant for anyone willing to look past the illusion, anyone willing to question, anyone willing to awaken. You, watching this video right now, are participating in something older than written history, the search for hidden knowledge. Let me ask you something genuinely, not as a rhetorical question. What part of today's revelation resonated with you the most? Was it the idea that the stars encoded a forgotten warning? The possibility that psychological patterns behave like ancient archons? Or the insight that your inner light is the one thing these forces cannot imitate? Tell me in the comments. Your voice matters here, because this community is not built on blind belief. It's built on seekers sharing perspectives, experiences, and insights. When you comment, when you question, when you reflect, you help keep alive a tradition that was nearly wiped from history. And here is the final, most important truth. The search for knowledge does not end with this video. It does not end with any book, any doctrine, or any teacher. The Gnostics believed the real journey begins only when the seeker realizes the path lies within. Every question you ask, every illusion you break, every layer you peel back brings you closer to the source behind all things. If this journey moved you, if it awakened something inside you, then subscribe to this channel, like this video, and share it with someone who feels the same hunger for truth. By doing that, you are not just supporting the channel, you are helping preserve the memory of these hidden revelations, ensuring they are not buried again. You become part of a lineage of seekers who refuse to sleep inside the illusion. And so I leave you with one final question, the kind that lingers long after the video ends. If the stars still carry fragments of the forgotten code, what might they reveal to you if you dared to look again?